Today in the Daily Dose, the explorers. Jacques Cousteau. Born in the south of France in 1910, young Jacques Cousteau developed a fascination with the ocean, joining the French Naval Academy at age 20, where he aspired to be a naval aviator. Sidelined by a horrific car crash that broke both his arms, he turned back to his interest in the sea, co-inventing the aqualung with French engineer Émile Ganneau in the 1960s. He also went on to design a series of diving bells, which eventually reached depths of 1,640 feet. Known as Conch Shelf 1, 2, and 3, Cousteau pioneered underwater habitats for oceanauts, as he called them, allowing researchers to live and work for weeks without returning to the surface, which in turn paved the way for human survival techniques in other harsh environments like outer space. Over the course of his lifetime, Cousteau created numerous organizations dedicated to oceanic exploration and environmental conservation, as well as producing an astounding output of books and films about the ocean, including his first published work, The Silent World, followed by a documentary film of the same name, which later won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival. His now famous floating lab, the Calypso, allowed Cousteau and his team to undertake underwater archaeologic expeditions, discovering a dizzying array of shipwrecks and war relics, including the HMHS Britannic and the 17th century French wreck La Thérèse. His observations into the life aquatic also led to many scientific findings, such as his proposal that dolphins navigate ocean waters using sonar echolocation, which was later confirmed by marine biologists. In 1966, Cousteau produced the wildly popular The Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau, which made his red bonnet, French accent, and personalized adventure style a beloved television experience over the show's 10-year run. A second documentary series called The Cousteau Odyssey kept the intrepid adventurer in the spotlight from 1977 to 1982. During his many decades of exploration, Cousteau began to acknowledge the detrimental effects of human activity on the ocean, reporting on pollution and its winnowing effects on marine diversity in ocean waters thousands of miles from land. He also helped restrict commercial whaling activity by using his platform to apply pressure on heads of states, which led the International Whaling Commission to ban commercial whaling in 1986. By his death at age 87 in 1997, Cousteau's legacy includes more than 120 documentary films, more than 50 books, and an environmental protection foundation with over 300,000 members, leading him once to proclaim that the sea, the great unifier, is man's only hope. Now as never before, the old phrase has a literal meaning. We are all in the same boat. Edmund Hillary, the first man to climb Mount Everest. After serving in World War II as a navigator for the Royal New Zealand Air Force, Edmund Hillary dedicated himself to his love of mountaineering, including the yet unachieved crown jewel of mountain climbing, a successful ascent of Mount Everest. In 1949, a long-standing route to the summit of Everest was closed by Chinese-controlled Tibet, while the Nepalese side of the mountain only allowed 1 or 2 expeditions a year. Selected by the 9th British Expedition to Everest, team leader John Hunt tapped out Hillary to join the attempt. The expedition totaled over 400 people, including 362 porters, 20 Sherpa guides, and over 10,000 pounds of gear. The expedition set up base camp in March of 1953, working up the mountain to establish their final camp at South Col at 25,900 feet. On March 26, 2 climbers attempted the final ascent until their oxygen systems failed less than 300 vertical feet from the summit. Hunt then directed Hillary and Sherpa guide Tenzing Norgay to follow where the last two had failed. The two pitched a tent at 27,900 feet on May 28th, while their three-man support team returned down the mountain. The following morning, wearing 30-pound packs, the two climbers attempted the final ascent, until a 40-foot ice face approaching the summit nearly turned them back. Known today as the Hillary Step, Hillary later wrote that he noticed a crack between the rock and the snow sticking to the east face. He crawled inside and wiggled and jammed his way to the top. Tenzing followed behind him as Hillary chopped footholds for the two men to ascend the forbidden face. Then he saw that the ridge ahead dropped away to the north, while above him stood a snow dome. A few more whacks with his ice axe, and suddenly Hillary and Tenzing stood on the top of the world. Tenzing left chocolates at the summit as an offering to Hindu gods, while Hillary left a crucifix given to him by John Hunt. Their descent down the mountain was a treacherous one, since drifting snow had covered their tracks. When they finally made their way down to South Col, the first person they met was George Low. "Well, George," said Hillary, "we knocked the bastard off." Hillary would later go on to reach the South Pole in 1958, followed by the North Pole in 1985 in the company of Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon. Hillary would be the first person to reach both poles, as well as the successful ascent of Everest. Alan Shephard, the first American in space. A graduate of the Naval Academy at Annapolis, Alan Shephard saw action in the Navy during World War II, becoming a naval aviator in 1946 and a test pilot in 1950. Selected as one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts in 1959, Shephard proved to be the definition of the right stuff when he piloted his Mercury Redstone 3 rocket into space on May 5, 1961. Before ascending up to the capsule, Shephard paused to admire his massive rocket, later recalling that he suddenly realized he would never see the beast again. Flight delays rolled on for more than 4 hours until he finally asked for a bathroom break. Denied by the flight director, Shephard was encouraged by ground personnel to simply let it go. He later recalled that he was completely dry by liftoff due to the wicking nature of his cotton undergarments and the capsule's environment of 100% oxygen. Named Freedom 7 by Shephard himself, his 15-minute flight would take him 150 miles up into space, where he was able to fully control the pitch, roll, and yaw of his spacecraft. Upon his return to Earth, Shephard became an instant national celebrity, flying into space a mere 3 weeks after Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. Designated as the commander of the first crewed Gemini flight, he was grounded in 1963 due to Meniere's disease, an inner ear condition that causes extreme bouts of dizziness and nausea. After the ailment was surgically corrected in 1969, Shephard commanded Apollo 14, becoming the fifth and oldest man to walk on the moon. One of the crew had smuggled the head of a 6-iron in one of their utility pockets of their spacesuits, and when Shephard attached the head to a shaft-like piece of the lunar lander, he took 4 one-handed swings on the moon due to the restrictive nature of his spacesuit. While the record for the longest golf shot on Earth is held by Mike Austin at 515 yards, when Shephard finally connected on his final shot, it is estimated that the ball traveled upwards of 1 mile, or 1,760 yards, through the moon's reduced gravitational pull. On the moon, anyway. We're gonna need a bigger course. Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. Born in the village of Klushino near Gazatsk, a city that would later bear his name, Yuri Gagarin flew for the Soviet Air Forces before being selected along with 5 other cosmonauts for the Soviet space program. As the Cold War and subsequent space race escalated between the United States and the USSR, Gagarin would stun the world by beating the Americans into space. On April 12, 1961, Gagarin boarded his Vostok 1 space capsule for a successful liftoff. He orbited the Earth for 108 minutes before re-entering Earth's atmosphere, ejecting from his capsule at 23,000 feet for a parachute drop safely down to Earth. Gagarin became an instant national hero and was awarded the Soviet Union's highest medal for valor. Beginning in 1962, the Soviet Union began celebrating the day of Gagarin's flight as Cosmonautics Day, which was later renamed International Day of Human Spaceflight. The flight would be his sole trip into space, although he did serve as backup crew for the ill-fated Soyuz 1 spaceflight, which ended in a fatal crash, killing his friend and fellow cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov. Fearing for the life of their national hero, Soviet officials permanently banned Gagarin from further spaceflights. He died in 1968 when his MiG-15 training jet crashed near the town of Kurtsak, taking the life of Gagarin and flight instructor Vladimir Zarogin. Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space. After cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space in 1961, Director of Cosmonaut Training Nikolai Kakamin read in an American media source that female pilots in the U.S. were training to become astronauts. As a result, Kakamin gained approval for an all-female cosmonaut program, which began training in 1963. Born on March 6, 1937, textile worker Valentina Tereshkova had no previous desire to fly in space. However, her love of skydiving made her an excellent candidate for the Soviet space program. Training included isolation tests, centrifuge G-force tests, thermo-chamber tests, decompression chamber tests, and pilot training in MiG-15 fighter jets. On June 16, 1963, Tereshkova reached outer space in her Vostok 6 rocket after a flawless liftoff. Although she experienced nausea and physical discomfort for most of the flight, she orbited the Earth 48 times in just under 3 days, making her the first and only woman to solo in space. As was the protocol in all Vostok missions, Tereshkova ejected from her capsule during its descent at about 4 miles above the Earth, parachuting to the ground in Kazakhstan on June 19, 1963. After the dissolution of the first group of female cosmonauts in 1969, Tereshkova stayed on at the Soviet space program as an instructor, graduating from the Zhukovsky Air Force Engineering Academy and retiring from the Air Force in 1997, having attained the rank of Major General. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Tereshkova was elected in 2011 to the National State Duma, much like the American House of Representatives, re-elected for a second term in 2016. Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. During his residency at the Perry Lane Artist Colony near the campus of Stanford University, Ken Kesey earned a graduate fellowship in creative writing after graduating from the University of Oregon. After participating in government-sponsored studies on the effects of hallucinogenic drugs such as mescaline and LSD, he wrote the wildly successful novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. During his literary rise, Kesey assembled an entourage of first-generation acid heads known as the Merry Pranksters, who modified an old 1939 International Harvester school bus into a traveling road show known as Further, or in popular culture, the Magic Bus. When the publication of his second novel, Sometimes a Great Notion, required his presence in New York, Kesey and his Merry Pranksters took to the road in Further for an LSD-soaked road trip to the East Coast as they attempted to create art out of everyday life. The entire journey was filmed for a planned movie that never came together, while at the wheel of Further was hammer-tossing Neil Cassidy, who was author Jack Kerouac's inspiration for his road-hungry character Dean Moriarty in his Beat Generation novel On the Road. Speakers on the inside of the bus piped in road sounds from outside the bus, while speakers on top of the bus blared the sounds of the pranksters from inside the bus, creating a mayhem of competing sounds for the tripping occupants within. The pranksters were given prankster names, which foretold the pranking madness of what it meant to be on the bus. There was Doris DeLay, on account of her uncanny likeness to film star Doris Day. There was Generally Famished, on account of her constant hunger during the now legendary acid-fueled bus trip. There was Hassler, on account of the fact that he hassled with all things electronic and audio during the acid test that would follow the bus trip. Others included Black Maria, Cool Breeze, Hermit, Zonker, Gretchen Fetchen the Slime Queen, Stark Naked the Beauty Witch, Something's Missing, Cadaverous Cowboy, Pitcher, No Turn Unstoned, Mary Microgram, Barely Visible, the Minister of Information, and of course the Chief, Ken Kesey himself, at the helm of his merry band of truth seekers, as they attempted to unvalve their minds through acid. Once the pranksters had done their New York thing, they headed upstate for a visit with Timothy Leary, who was the undisputed acid guru of the eastern seaboard. While Leary contended that a controlled set and setting were vital for a safe acid trip, Kesey and the pranksters believed in multimedia madness for their now legendary acid tests held in and around the San Francisco Bay Area, which included immense light shows that beamed old movies in psychedelic spirals, lava blobs, and black light shooting stars everywhere throughout their chosen festival site. Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead became the pranksters' house band, creating the sort of mellow, spongy music that acid heads found irresistible. The high watermark for the pranksters began to unravel in late 1966, after the federal government outlawed the use or possession of LSD. Even before the law was passed, Kesey was arrested on a largely trumped-up possession of marijuana charge at his La Honda home. Following a second marijuana arrest 2 days later, a two-strike crime at the time that came with a mandatory prison sentence. In response, Kesey faked his own suicide by having friends leave his truck on a cliffside near Eureka, along with an elaborate suicide note written by the pranksters. Kesey fled to Mexico in the back of a friend's car, only to return to the States 8 months later, where he was promptly apprehended by police. After serving 5 months in the San Mateo County Jail, upon his release, he moved back to his family farm in Pleasant Hill, Oregon, where he maintained a secluded, family-oriented lifestyle for the rest of his life. Perhaps still a prankster at heart, but a prankster no more. The first men on the moon. After the Apollo 1 launch pad fire that tragically took the lives of Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, Apollo mission engineers and key flight leaders paused to reassess the risks of a successful manned mission to the moon and back, identifying 13 risk stages and risk reduction controls before launching a single unmanned test flight, followed by 3 manned flights that concluded with Apollo 10's successful orbital flights around the moon. Apollo 11 was to follow, landing 2 men on the moon in an event that saw the world hold its collective breath during liftoff in a tense lunar landing, followed by a second collective gasp of wonder when Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. Launching into an Earth orbit of 114 by 116 miles on July 16, 1969, with Commander Neil Armstrong, Command Module Pilot Michael Collins, and Lunar Module Pilot Edwin Buzz Aldrin, 2 hours and 44 minutes later, the crew refired their SIVB stage rocket for a 5-minute burn, successfully placing Apollo 11 into trans-lunar orbit, followed by a 3-second burn a day later for a planned mid-course correction. Celebrating the first color TV transmission to Earth, on the 4th day of their flight, the Eagle lunar landing vehicle undocked from Columbia for its descent to the lunar surface. Changing course at the last minute due to previously unseen obstacles in their intended landing zone, before touching down in the Sea of Tranquility, just as the Eagle ran out of fuel. Spending 21 hours and 36 minutes on the lunar surface, Armstrong and Aldrin blasted off the moon on July 21st for a successful redocking with Columbia at 128 hours and 3 minutes into Apollo 11's flight. After the lunar module was jettisoned 4 hours later, the Command Service Module achieved trans-Earth injection that same day, splashing down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24, 1969, after a flight of 195 hours, 18 minutes and 35 seconds, an achievement that pushed the boundaries of human exploration in space. Now 54 years later, NASA plans to return to the moon as early as 2024, with planned lunar landings in 2025 or 2026. This time with digital rather than analog technology, making Apollo 11 a seminal achievement just 66 years after the Wright brothers' first flight. The last men on the moon.
The eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon, and to the planets beyond.
After John F. Kennedy's now famous "Let's go to the moon" speech, 1/5 of humanity watched Neil Armstrong walk on the lunar surface. But after multiple Apollo flights would follow Armstrong's achievement, the world, along with American politicians engaged in an expensive war in Southeast Asia, seemed to lose interest in the technological wonders of putting men on the moon and returning them safely back to Earth. When budget cuts came down from Washington, NASA was forced to cancel its last 3 missions, making Apollo 17 the last time men would walk on the moon. The 12-day mission in December of 1972 included Commander Gene Cernan, module pilot Jack Schmitt, and command module pilot Ronald Evans. And while the crew has been written up in history books and acknowledged by the space and scientific communities, none have received the public recognition they so rightly deserved. Apollo 17 broke multiple records, including 3 days on the lunar surface, with moonwalks lasting up to 8 hours at a crack. After landing in the Taurus-Littrow Valley, they deployed scientific instruments while collecting a treasure trove of lunar samples for scientists to study back on Earth. Apollo 17 was the first mission to have no one on board who had been a test pilot, and also marked the first night launch in U.S. human spaceflight history. While the 3 unused Apollo spacecraft were later repurposed in the Skylab and Apollo-Soyuz program, Apollo 17 marked the last launch of a Saturn V rocket. Now that Americans have a growing interest in returning to the moon before conquering a landing on Mars, a hearty salute to the nearly 400,000 men and women who made the Apollo moon landings a high-water mark in human achievement. And there you have it, the Explorers. Today's Daily Dose documentary is brought to you by PlatoSpeech.com, a lesson planning tool leveraging content like this and much more for educators and homeschooling parents. Check out the description for more information so that you too can teach something new every day.